You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Now, we've seen through history how many great powers have been able to trounce their opponents on the battlefield. They've been able to lay waste to their enemies militarily, but then they've struggled to achieve their goals during peacetime. It seems a bit odd that you can go through a long military campaign, win the war, but lose the peace. It seems odd, but it also seems very, very common. Why is that? G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, the humblest host you know of a podcast focusing on war and warfare, named after a 19th century Prussian military thinker. I'd like to thank all of our supporters on Patreon first, the legends. Thank you very much. You keep the lights on for the show. You're doing a great job. All those people who've been using our Amazon affiliate links to buy books, that's excellent. That also keeps the lights on. We have a lot of lights in this studio. And also, those people have been providing us reviews on their podcast platforms, in particular, those people helping us climb up the podcast charts in the US, Great Britain. Well, only a certain amount of time we can call it that for a while, and also Australia as well. We've slipped a bit in Guatemala, but I'm sure you'll do your best to get us back up there. Now, my topic today is about winning wars and losing pieces. And that's not pieces of puzzle. It is the piece. And I don't know much about it, so I got a guest in. My guest today is Brendan Gallagher. He's a US Army Lieutenant Colonel in Australian parlance, Lieutenant Colonel in American parlance in the infantry, and he's completed 7 tours to Iraq and Afghanistan. This has included multiple deployments with the 75th Ranger Regiment. He received the General George C. Marshall Award as a top US graduate at the Army Command and General Staff College, and is currently a battalion commander. And he's actually given us time to talk on the show, which is quite amazing. He holds a PhD in Public and International Affairs from Princeton. He has written a book that's just been released, which is what caught my eye, and it is called The Day After: Why America Wins the War but Loses the Peace. Now, noting that Brendan is an active US Army officer and a battalion commander, the first commanding officer like I've had on the show in terms of currently commanding a battalion, I'd just like to point out that all views expressed by Brendan on the show are his own and not representative of the US Army, his unit, or the US Department of Defense. My views, however, listeners, are mine, and they represent the Dead Prussian podcast. No matter what anyone else from the Dead Prussian podcast team says, I am representing all of our views. Brendan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a terrific opportunity and great to be able to take part in a podcast that seeks to unpack important issues and challenges related to war. And I look forward to our conversation today.
Now, Brendan, before we start discussing your book, I think I know the answer because you've mainly been from what I can see, a pretty active participant. But I'm keen to find out what got you interested in researching war.
Well, I just as you point out, I've had the privilege and the honor to serve in uniform for 18 years and counting as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army. And it so happens that I was commissioned as an officer in mid-2001, just a few months before the attacks of September 11th happened. And so over the 18 years that have followed, I've had the privilege to deploy alongside many, many other valiant, terrific, brave, courageous service members repeatedly to these war zones, specifically in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've deployed there 7 times. And when you do that, when you get to deploy again and again, you kind of get to see how these war zones evolve over time. And what really kind of motivated me to tackle this topic was the fact that when you're overseas and you're doing patrol after patrol and operation after operation, sometimes you're very busy, but at other times you get a chance to kind of step back briefly, catch your breath for a moment, and you get to kind of think about things and think about where you are and where you've come from. And I would sometimes wonder, how did we get here? In other words, what were the kind of initial plans that helped to spawn in some cases, some fairly chaotic and violent conditions on the ground? And, why didn't we prepare ourselves for some of those challenges before they hit us head on? And so now, fast forward to today, to the year 2019, we're in a situation where now the U.S. has incurred some pretty significant costs from these conflicts in terms of, trillions of dollars that have been spent, many thousands of lives that have been lost, others that have suffered debilitating and life-changing injuries, not to mention many, many more times of casualties and lives lost by the local populations in some of these countries. There have been other costs in terms of reputational cost to the U.S. Credibility and standing on the world stage, opportunity costs of other things we might have done with our time and energy. And unfortunately, instead of getting some of the outcomes that we had hoped for at the beginning, we've sometimes seen even more instability and violence and terrorism unfold. And so the costs have been quite high. I've lost soldiers under my command. I lost one of my closest friends in these conflicts. And so all of that helped to motivate this book. So I hope this book can answer some very basic questions. Specifically, how and why did we mishandle these recent wars? What were the initial plans going into them? And could we have perhaps made better choices and perhaps fostered better outcomes? And perhaps finally, what should we learn from all this? So that's kind of a bit of my background and what motivated me to take on this topic.
Interesting. Now, you talked a bit about your book. It's called, The Day After, Why America Wins the War But Loses the Peace. Now, can you provide our listeners with a little bit more of an understanding of what exactly you mean by this title and where you're going with your book? And we'll get deeper into the book soon, but just, I suppose, an overview of why it's important.
Sure. So the book explores, in essence, why the U.S. has been extremely successful in achieving initial battlefield victories, for example, in toppling the Taliban in Afghanistan in very short order, toppling Saddam Hussein in Iraq, toppling Gaddafi in Libya, only to discover that we really had no coherent plan for what should come next. And so in the initial phase, we accomplished what we, pretty much precisely what we set out to accomplish. But then it was kind of like the dog chasing the car where, we catch it, but then we seem to have not a clear conception of what should come next. And in a way, it's really unfortunate because there were certainly very significant challenges at stake in each of these countries without question. And some of those challenges included, an unfamiliar culture. There were diverse ethnic and tribal groups. There were, in some cases, multiple languages spoken by the local people, challenging terrain, a civil society that had been oppressed for decades under autocratic rule, a lack of functioning, reliable institutions, no familiarity or history with democracy, plus other specific challenges in some of these countries. So without question, there were very significant challenges. But I would also suggest there were at least some limited opportunities or mildly favorable aspects which we might have tried to build upon. And it can be easy to forget some of these in hindsight. So in Afghanistan, for example, there was an almost unprecedented shock and trauma in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks that gave great political capital, very significant capital for the U.S. to use however the Bush administration might have seen fit. And in theory, that might have helped us craft a coherent plan alongside our friends and allies in post-war Afghanistan that could have garnered widespread support. In Iraq, obviously very significant challenges without question. But on the plus side, we did have years to think about and prepare for a post-Saddam landscape. And we also had our experience in the Persian Gulf War in 1990 to 1991, which we also might have learned from. And in Libya, again, very significant challenges. But we also had a chance to learn from the recent missteps in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in theory could have formed a better, more coherent plan building upon those lessons. And so it's really unfortunate because we failed to capitalize on some of those limited opportunities, and things really started to fall apart shortly after we toppled these regimes. And so overall, my book looks at, why were we so successful in the initial military phase and then so unsuccessful in planning and preparing for what would come next.
Right, and you mentioned some of the areas and the conflicts you discuss in your book, but it's pretty clear that the focus is on the recent conflicts in the Middle East and Central Asia. However, that's you've served for 18 years. Those of us that have been that served in these conflicts have a lot of us that spanned our entire military careers. So, which wars in particular is it? Is it everything that's happening in the Middle East today? Is it everything that's happened since 2001? What war in particular, I suppose, or conflicts is the biggest focus that you see is the risk of losing the peace in?
Yeah, I try to orient my book so that hopefully it can be kind of a go-to book, if you will, covering really the last 20 or so years of war. And I think during that period, you can almost take your pick of any major military intervention we've been involved with since then. So, we took down the Taliban in really a matter of weeks in the fall of 2001. We took down the Iraqi military, again, in a matter of weeks in the period from March to April of 2003. And then we provided air support and what we called unique capabilities that helped the Libyan rebels over 7 months in 2011, culminating in Gaddafi's death in late October of 2011. And so in each case, you had these initial military victories, and for a brief moment in time, a period of self-congratulations, of patting ourselves on the back, popping the champagne, whatever analogy you'd like to use. And we really got ourselves in a position to impose our will on the local area. And really that's in general sense, that's what we kind of talk about with the idea of war sometimes, is that it's being putting yourself in a position to dominate the enemy and allow yourself to impose your will on the enemy. And that's more or less what we did successfully in all three cases. We were in position to impose our will, just as the advocates for war had hoped. So we set out to do something. We did that. But then, of course, things began to fall apart. And so the book explores why things began to fall apart in these places and why the post-war plans began to become unglued.
Right. And I suppose you infer that, from even just the title, I suppose, most listeners will get the idea. But you infer that America will lose the peace. Not saying it's definite, but it's a pretty clear cut statement. How if it wins the war, and I mean, some of my listeners will understand this, some of them won't. Most of them probably understand it better than I do. But if it wins the war, if it achieves the political objectives out on the battlefield, how will it actually lose the peace? Or I suppose if it achieves the military objectives, the purpose of the war and the fighting, how does it actually lose the peace?
Well, I suggest in the book that there is a fundamental tension that tends to undermine our efforts again and again. And so, in other words, these are not just one-off isolated cases, but there's actually a pattern at play. And specifically, I argue that there are two tendencies that pull us in fundamentally opposing directions in these situations. So on the one hand, there is this desire to create a democracy, a new democracy in our own image. We topple a given regime. And so if you were to ask a room full of Americans, well, hey, what do you think should come next? What sort of government do you think should emerge? Chances are, all other things being equal, folks would say, well, probably a democracy that looks more or less like us. And that idea has roots that go back quite a ways back in American history to Woodrow Wilson and other key periods in our history. So that's one idea, is to create a democracy in our own image. which by its nature requires a serious investment of time and resources to really have any reasonable chance of a decent outcome, of fostering those institutions that take an extended time to take root, especially for a country with no history or familiarity with democracy. So that's the one tendency on the one side of the scale. On the other hand, I suggest there's a countervailing tendency in that we want to kind of pull out or withdraw at the very soonest opportunity. So the idea that, hey, we did what we came to do, we accomplished it, high fives, and now let's get out of here. Let's bring the boys back home, refocus on other things. And this idea, I would argue, has roots in some of the quagmires, or at least perceived quagmires, going back to you could look at the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. You could look at the Black Hawk Down events in Somalia in 1993. You could look more recently in Iraq, but just the general idea that, hey, we cannot get bogged down in this country. We have got to wrap things up, get the boys back home, and avoid getting trapped in the quicksand of these places. And so that's the fundamental tension at place, because you have, on the one hand, this desire to create the democracy, which takes time, it takes effort, it takes a long-term investment for any prospect of a decent outcome. On the other hand, you have this desire to get out. And so do we stay and do we invest in creating a stable functioning democracy, or do we do a quick handoff and sprint to the exits? And one of the analogies I point to in the book, it's kind of a comedic example, but there was an old Saturday Night Live sketch in 1976 in which they had this kind of faux commercial for this product called New Shimmer. And there's a married couple that is debating whether New Shimmer is a floor wax or a dessert topping. And the husband and the wife are debating back and forth that, it's a floor wax. No, New Shimmer is a dessert topping. No, it's a floor wax, a dessert topping. And then Chevy Chase emerges out of nowhere, and he comes in and he says, guys, relax. New Shimmer is a floor wax and a dessert topping. And everybody starts to clap, and it's a great ending. But this bit works because it's so nonsensical to be able to think that you could combine those two things together that fundamentally do not go together. And I would suggest it's a similar kind of trap that we fall into, where we try to create democracy, but do it on the cheap. We think we can do it in 6 months, pull out, and somehow this will create a democracy. And that is the fundamental tension, I argue, that's in place. And then additionally, I also suggest there's certain pathologies, I call them pathologies, that tend to undermine our efforts even more so. Things like magical thinking, things like, kind of shallow learning from the past, and that we only kind of selectively learn certain lessons from previous historical incidents that are favorable to what we want to accomplish, and ignore the parts that are uncomfortable. And then we also tend to underuse our National Security Council, which is the one entity in the U.S. government that might conceivably be able to tie the State Department and the Department of Defense and other key agencies and entities together to help craft a coherent plan, because it can't just be the military. It has to be part of a coherent overall plan. So all of these aspects, I argue, make what is inherently a very difficult task that much harder.
And I guess I'm going to ask the question that historians don't like me asking. Political scientists never give me an answer on, but I'm hoping your background gives me something nice and easy on this. If your premise is right, is there an option for correcting the course? Given these wars have already begun, the political motivation for these wars have started, and, the political impetus for these wars continues to change. But is there a way to avoid losing the peace?
Well, I would argue that actually, if we go back to the late 90s, I would argue we actually did reasonably well in the case of Kosovo, which I would argue was a partial success. Now, before I say anything further about Kosovo, I do need to acknowledge that Kosovo was indeed easier in several ways as compared to some of these other more recent conflicts. So Kosovo's clearly smaller, smaller in geography, smaller in population. You had a population that a significant part of it actively wanted and was looking for Western intervention. You had a regime in Serbia that was kind of a different type of coercive regime as compared to Saddam's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya. And Kosovo is actually located in Europe, which helped to motivate a greater desire for intervention by NATO. And so Kosovo, we do need to say up front, it was indeed easier in several ways. But I would say hindsight bias can help us to, can kind of prompt us to overlook that there are actually also a lot of challenges in Kosovo. So Kosovo was very tenuous at the time and quite easily could have gone completely off the rails following that initial military victory in 1999. So you had ethnic cleansing, you had atrocities that were already underway, you had some headlines that were referring to the Balkans as possibly Bill Clinton's Vietnam. You had a lot of folks that were predicting that, hey, if we get tied into Kosovo, if we get troops on the ground at any point, this could be an absolute quagmire that could sink the Clinton administration. But I would suggest that at the time, the leadership in that administration actually spent a fair amount of time and energy looking and learning from the past, especially from its 1990s interventions in places like Somalia, in Haiti, in Bosnia. You also had the experience in Rwanda, basically the decision not to intervene, the lack of intervention in Rwanda. Some of those interventions went okay, others were seen as debacles, but the point is they actually learned from some of those experiences and really just overall absorb the lesson that you need a robust plan across the whole of government to deal with a complex post-conflict environment. And it would have been problematic to just say, hey, congratulations, you're liberated, the day that the last bullet is fired, and then immediately head out the exit door. I think the folks in power at the time had absorbed that lesson from all of those previous interventions, which I refer to kind of as a school of hard knocks that they endured throughout the 1990s. So if we had just said, hey, Kosovo, you're liberated, congratulations, we're out of here, it is far more likely in that case that Kosovo would have devolved back into bloody ethnic violence between the ethnic Serbs and the Kosovar Albanians. And today we might be sitting here perhaps talking about why Kosovo was destined to fail instead of whether it was too easy. So now, but looking beyond our kind of partial qualified success in Kosovo, I'd also suggest that one of the most important lessons as far as how to avoid losing the peace is really being highly selective in the first place and choosing when to even go to war. And really only doing so when we have a reasonable chance of a decent outcome. And obviously also when when core values and interests for the United States are at stake. So, if we were in theory to try to start wars everywhere to implant democracy all over the place at the tip of a gun, that would certainly be folly. So there has to be some selectivity, and that sense of kind of selectivity and strategic prudence has been a bit lacking in recent times. And so then the second thing is, if you do at a certain point find yourself in a war, that decision has already been made, you've crossed that line in the sand, then you need to develop an overall coherent strategy. And that, I would argue, consists of really three key elements. You have to have a realistic, achievable goal. You have to have a sense of the obstacles that could get in the way of that goal. And then you also have to mobilize resources that align with your goal. And I think if you take those steps, I would argue that you do not guarantee success, but you at least improve the odds of a decent and tolerable outcome.
Well, there you go, listeners. If you need to start a war, you just need to give Brendan a call to make sure that you have the end game in sight. Now, Brendan, before we get to the bonus question, I guess I want to find out what surprised you the most whilst conducting your research for this book.
Yeah, I would suggest a couple of things. So the first thing that really surprised me is that there actually were indeed plans for some of these countries. So, when I was doing my research, especially in the earlier phases, and I'd talk with different people about my research topic, and they would ask me what it's about, and I say, well, it involves post-war planning in places like Iraq. A lot of times, the most common response I get from folks was, well, what post-war planning? So implying that we must have just forgotten to do it altogether. But soon I found that actually was not the case, because I spent many, many hours interviewing the exact people who developed these plans for Iraq and for Libya, and for some of these places. And the problem was that there wasn't just one plan, but there were often multiple plans. And these plans competed with each other. And the highest levels of the US government often did not make a firm decision on which plan to execute. And so then when Saddam falls or Gaddafi falls, it's not clear which of the multiple plans we would implement. And so that surprised me, the fact that there actually were in fact plans, and I reviewed those plans as part of my research. And then the one other thing I would highlight as far as what surprised me was, in many cases, how kind of blunt and candid some of my interviewees were. So, in the course of doing the research for this book, I had the opportunity to interview dozens of U.S. civilian and military officials. Some of them were mid-level officials. Some were, 4-star generals and admirals and cabinet secretaries. And in some cases, it was actually quite surprising to me how raw some of the emotions still were years later. And in some cases, some of the officials were still quite obviously quite upset at what had unfolded, and the fact that they felt that at the time they had been trying to get the ship going in the right direction, but that in some cases others in the government or other kind of bureaucratic forces were actively undermining their efforts. And so that aspect also surprised me. But I think the accounts by many of these interviewees, I think, adds an additional layer of richness to the overall book that I think helps convey some of the key themes.
Now, Brendan, we're going to switch now to provide our Patreon supporters, these are the people that help us keep the lights on, with a bonus question. So we'll quickly just have a pause. Brendan, we're come to what we sometimes refer to as the butcher's bill on the show. It's the cost for coming on. It's the final question. Every guest gets it. It's one I ask of everyone, and it relates to our mission on the show, which is to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, and continue what is important in terms of the public conversation, and that is debating war, what it is, and its role within society. I ask each guest to finish a sentence. The sentence starts with "war is." So right now, Brendan, I ask you to finish the sentence, "war is."
Well, being on the Dead Prussian podcast, I would be strongly tempted to go with the first answer that comes to mind, which is war is politics by other means. And it actually is a key theme in the book. And, we often use that expression. We often say that almost out of habit, sometimes almost as a throwaway line. Oh yeah, war is politics by other means. But then when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of actually waging war, we kind of tend to forget that. And we kind of tend to forget that battlefield events that unfold in the short term often pale in comparison to the lasting political outcomes. And that lasting political endgame is where true victory or defeat lies. So that is the idea that war is politics by other means, I think, is the answer that I would provide for you today.
Excellent. Thank you for a totally unoriginal definition for a war. It's been a long time since we've actually had someone have the temerity to quote Big Carl on the show, but our listeners might enjoy that given the premise of your book and what we've discussed today. It's probably particularly relevant. Now, Brendan, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. Terrific conversation, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Now, listeners, you can support Brendan's work by buying his book. I'm not saying this show purely exists to flog the books of our guests, but we do know that with books, particularly The Allure of Battle, there were quite a few people that were interested and have gone out and got the book since. Make sure you use our Amazon link if you do, because that also helps us out. But most importantly is getting the book of those guests that come on the show if they have a book. If they don't have a book, then obviously you can't do much. But Brendan's book, The Day After, Why America Wins the War but Loses the Peace, is available at Amazon. We have links through our affiliate page in our show notes and on our website. So please jump on board, grab yourself a copy of the book, and also head along to Twitter and follow Brendan at Princeton Ranger. And that's spelt like Princeton and Ranger together as one word. Follow him on Twitter and join him in the conversation on what is a very, very important topic, particularly for our modern generation of warfighters and policymakers. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.